Welcome to the 20th episode of the Rain Race podcast. Today we're going to be previewing the upcoming Petit Le Mans. We're going to be talking about some IndyCar team developments, and we're going to round it all off with some Formula One silly season updates. I'm Chris Aurelio. This is Rain Race. Let's go. Episode 20 of the Rain Race podcast here for the first time since the end of August. It's now October 4th at the time of this recording, and I'm joined alongside Kevin Rollins.
Yeah, I want to say for the record that the hiatus wasn't our fault, but we blame Kyle Cuthbertson.
Kevin and I decided that we're going to keep the show on the road. We're going to try our hardest to return to more frequent episodes now that our schedule is a little bit more freed up depending on some variables. And we do have some more specials planned, so stay tuned if you want to check those out. But I want to start off today with a quick Petit Le Mans, actually not really quick, but a rather in-depth Petit Le Mans preview. Petit Le Mans, the final race of the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship, will be hitting Road Atlanta in just over a week's time now. So there's a couple things I want to go over. First off, we have Performance Tech returning in the prototype category. Their first race back since, was it Long Beach or was it Watkins Glen?
It was Glen.
Yeah, it's been a really long... I mean, I should have known that. I was at that race, but it's been a really long time since we've seen that car on track, so they're returning next weekend.
Their absence was because they wanted to actually do some testing and try to better themselves as a team and better their car in preparation for the final race of the North American Endurance Championship and also in preparation for next season.
Yeah, and that will be interesting because next season is, of course, that split between the DPI spec of cars and the LMP2 spec of cars. So we'll have to see how they fare in that category. We also have Ricci Competency only returning for the first time since Sebring. It's been a really pretty short season for them overall. They've only run 2 races so far, but returning for Petit Le Mans. Hopefully we see them on a more frequent basis next year, but of course depends on some funding and driver commitments.
One thing to know about Ricci is that all these financial issues stem back to Le Mans last year when they got punted by an LMP2 car and had to basically buy a new car. So hopefully they'll be back next year full-time. We'll see.
More surprisingly, and I brought this up after they got penalized at Daytona, I said I'd be surprised if we see them back, and I brought this up after Watkins Glen when they got penalized at the very end, said I'll be surprised if we see them back, but Land Motorsports is returning to Petit Le Mans, so obviously I think it's pretty admirable of them to not hold too many grudges with IMSA. It's certainly the opposite of what I expected to happen, but of course being an Audi Sport fan myself, I'm happy to see them on the grid. And lastly, we have P1 Motorsports with their Mercedes returning. That was more of a planned return because they were committed to the North American Endurance Championship. So it'll be great to see their Chupacabra liveried Mercedes back on track. We also have some driver switch-ups going on. Of course, Petit Le Mans clashing with the 6 Hours of Fuji and with a round of the DTM Championship. So we have Norman Nato taking over the number 2 ESM third driver position in place of Antonio Giovinazzi, and we're going to talk about why that is later. Basically, it's a Sauber F1 commitment, but again, more on that later in the episode. We also have Marino Franchitti taking over in the number 55 Mazda. That's for Harry Tinknell, who'll be driving a Ford over in Japan for the 6 Hours of Fuji. And Lucas Di Grassi taking over for Rene Rast in the 77 Mazda. Rast, of course, will be over trying to win another DTM championship. Another interesting development that we have is that Marcel Fassler is listed as the third driver in both Corvettes. Mike Rockenfeller has DTM commitments as well, so I'd be curious actually to see how that pans out. Obviously, it's not completely unprecedented, especially over in European GT3 racing, to have multiple drivers listed in the same car, but it is certainly something more unique on the U.S. side of things.
Well, 2 points on that. I personally, I really wish they would have brought back Benoit Choyue for the other Corvette. That would have been awesome. And the other thing is, you talk about drivers going in multiple cars. Well, a couple years ago at Nürburgring, we actually had the same driver lineup of 4 drivers between 2 cars, which was insane. And that was the Haro Mercedes. Rest in peace.
Yeah, so it really just sort of emphasizes the point I made about it being a more common thing over in Europe. Although I'd be curious to see how much trust Corvette puts in Marcel, because they have the number 3 car going for the Drivers' Championship. So Marcel Fassler doesn't necessarily have the cleanest track record with Corvette, although he is pretty quick. So I'd really be curious to see how much trust Corvette Racing has in Fassler to put him in a car that's fighting for a championship. And lastly, I just want to go over the point standings going into the final round between all 3 classes. In GTD, we have 6 points separating the number 48 Paul Miller Lamborghini and the number 86 Meyershank. I almost tripped up again. Acura NSX. Really interesting story for that number 86 car, considering that they were a part-time entry. Well, not really a part-time, but they were a race-by-race entry up until I believe we got to VIR. That's when they committed to the rest of the season. But that car really was supposed to be the second car to the sister 93 car. So it's really surprising to see them in the championship hunt, and not just that, but really only 6 points behind. So they really have a good shot at the championship for Petit. And in GTLM, we have 9 points separating the number 3 Corvette and the 67 Ford. It's really interesting about the number 3 Corvette because they haven't won a single race this season, but just through absolute consistency, they find themselves with a 9-point lead, and that's in comparison to the 67 Ford, who won 3 races this season over that summer stretch. And lastly, my favorite category, and the category that's also the closest this season, sort of surprisingly, is the prototype division, with only 4 points separating the 31 Action Express Cadillac and the number 54 Core Autosport Oreca. Now, I'm not going to go on a ramble, I promise, but I've made this point before that I didn't see a need for IMSA to split up the LMP2 cars and the DPI cars, and I think that this just further stresses that you have a big budget factory supported Cadillac going up against a Pro-Am global spec P2 Oreca, and it's really something cool to see. It's something that we haven't seen in the IMSA championship ever since the merger in 2014, so it's definitely the most exciting prototype championship hunt I think I've seen in almost a decade, I'd say. And it's really just something that I think we'll remember for years to come. This small Oreca Core Autosport team really throwing it up with the big factory-backed teams. And it's really a shame that we're going to have to see this go away next season.
I let them point out that Core Autosport's been through every single class in there. They've actually came up through the rankings legitimately. I mean, look how great they were in Prototype Challenge, kind of mediocre in GTD, and I mean, look what they did in Prototype, and they've done a fantastic job, and I hope they win the championship. Because I don't want Action Express to win another one every year.
Thinking at what Road Atlanta favors, I think that'll be interesting because Core has Romain Dumas back on their team, and he's a very fast driver. He's also a very aggressive driver, as proven at Watkins Glen. So first off, his job is to
factory driver.
Yeah, his job though will be just to keep the car clean, but also run fast. John Bennett, they're probably gonna get him in and get him out as quick as possible. Leave the rest of the race up to Braun and Dumas. I think I mean, based on the current BOP for that race, I think that the Orica might have the upper hand because it's one of those European-style tracks that we talked about middle of the season, like Watkins Glen, where the P2 cars really stretch their advantage. So I think that that's a track that Core will have the advantage going into. Main question will have to be if they crack under the pressure because Action Express, as you just mentioned, they're a championship-tested and proven team. They've done this multiple times before, so I fully expect them to go in with the utmost preparation and put forward an absolutely flawless race on their hands. So it's really going to come down to how Core manages it. Of course, the Cadillac does have that 4-point advantage, so it's kind of just the story of the underdog versus the advantaged, but like I've said before, it will be a very interesting title fight, and certainly the one that I'm most looking forward to in that championship.
I mean, when it comes down to the championship, the thing that has helped Sport is consistency. And we've seen throughout the year that the Action Express, the number 31, has been, well, a little reckless sometimes. I'm not going to point the blame at any certain driver, but Felipe Nasser does not have the best track record of being clean, so we'll see how this goes. I'm very, very curious, but I do hope Core gets it just to see something different for once.
Moving on from IMSA, I want to talk about IndyCar for a little bit here, and to give you some context on how long it's been since we've put out the previous episode, we've had 3 races ever since then. We had Gateway, Portland, and Sonoma. Sonoma, of course, being the championship race. But in the interest of not recapping races that are over a month old, we're going to skip recapping all of those. I mean, I feel like you would have already seen what was to come out of those races at this point, but of course, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the end of the season yet for some reason and you're still curious as to who the championship goes to, turn off the podcast right now because it went to Scott Dixon. Really put in an absolute flawless race at Sonoma. And while we're not going to go over complete recaps of the races, I mean, he really, I said it in our last episode that he was going to have to be Mr. Consistency, and he really, just really put that down, especially at Portland, taken out on the first lap, and still brings it home to, what was it, a top 5? I think it was 5th place at Portland, or maybe 6th. Yeah. Really just a stellar drive. Alexander Rossi put it all down. Really no faults on that end except for Sonoma, when at the very start he hit the back of Marco Andretti. Pretty much just set him at the back. And, I mean, really at that point, there was not much he could do. Dixon already had the championship in the bag at that point. He just had to bring it all home. So,
I mean, in the last episode we did with David Land, we all predicted which track favors who, and I think I nailed it on the head. I would have to go back and listen to it, but I said Gateway was going to be Rossi. It was, even though at first it was Dixon. I was there to see it, too. It was awesome. And then Portland was a toss-up, but we said it was Dixon. And then Sonoma, we definitely said Dixon.
Yeah, so Scott Dixon claiming his 5th title in the Verizon IndyCar Championship. And while I'm not fully confirmed on this right now, I do plan on having a more in-depth IndyCar special with possibly an IndyCar driver or 2. So, like I said at the beginning, stay tuned because you're going to want to check that out. No guarantees on that happening, though. We're going to have to make some things work and hopefully get a reply from Kyle and get him back in here first. But I just want to talk quickly about some IndyCar news. A lot of people would have been hoping that I'd be sitting here right now and saying, Fernando Alonso confirmed to this. Well, now. It's October now, and still really nothing on the Alonso side of things. I remember back in late August, early September, everybody was saying it's happening. It's guaranteed now. There's no doubt in my mind. Okay, no. Where's the news? Where's the confirmation? Where's the press release? I mean, it's really been a game of pretty much clickbait at this point. I mean, I feel like Alonso is having fun himself, just sort of getting everybody's hopes up and then pulling the plug and saying, well, I'm not here now. So we really don't know what his plans are at this point, but of course we're still going to be following that and updating that in future episodes. But what we have had confirmed is that Harding Racing is going into a partnership with Steinbrenner. So now they are Harding Steinbrenner Racing. They have a 2-car lineup confirmed for next year with Colton Herta and Pato O'Ward. Pato O'Ward, first off, I just want to point out, if you didn't know, made his IndyCar debut at Sonoma and really put in a pretty consistent, solid performance. So I'd be excited to see what he can do next year. So yeah, Kevin, you have some more details though on this whole Harding-Steinbrenner partnership.
Okay, so going into Sonoma, a lot of people were talking about how Andretti was helping the Harding Racing crew, and Michael Andretti gave us an explanation. Of course, how accurate the statement was is up to the imagination, but still. So basically, they were helping Harding Racing on setups and stuff like that. Basically, working with the dampers, just basic setup stuff like that. But people do like to talk and imagine things and make conspiracy theories because at the time everybody thought, oh, Harding Racing is where Fernando's going to go because Honda doesn't want him. Well, obviously now that's not the case because we have the drivers confirmed. But what kind of propelled that even further was the fact that Colton Herta, the son of Brian Herta, who owns one of the cars in Andretti's stable, is being a part of that team. I mean, again, the rumor mill is amazing to look at from a distance, but don't get involved.
We also had Felix Rosenquist confirmed to the number 10 Ganassi entry. That was, of course, the car that was previously inhabited by Ed Jones. Unfortunately, now it looks like he's going to be out of an IndyCar ride. His seat given up to Felix Rosenquist.
Poor Ed Jones. He really didn't have time to really mature. I mean, if we look at guys like Zach Veach, Michael Andretti is giving him plenty of time to come into his own element. Ed Jones really wasn't afforded that at Ganassi, and you can compare him easily to Darren Manning, who was in a very similar situation. Felix Rosenquist coming over from Formula E and other European series like that. I mean, I'm very curious to see what he can do. I mean, we're starting to see really an insurgence of guys who really didn't do that great or got disillusioned with the European racing scene, and they're coming over to IndyCar. It's a more and more common trend these days, really.
Yeah, of course, you mentioned his seat at Dale Coyne going away. We have some sources all but confirming that Santino Ferrucci will be full-time in the number 19. Now, let's just say, quick footnote, full-time is in Dale Coyne's terms, so take it as you want.
He'll probably race about a third of the races, and then, yeah.
Then I'll find someone with more money. But yeah, Santino Ferrucci, in quotes, confirmed for the 2019 IndyCar season. That's a bit controversial, of course, because of Santino Ferrucci's actions over in the Formula 2 Championship, especially in the 2018 season.
I mean, I've gotten justifications for that, so I could let it slide.
Personally, I think he deserves a second chance. I think that he really did realize his mistakes, but I don't want to get into the whole political aspect of it. I do think it's good on his behalf, though, that he gets a second chance to prove himself. He is an American driver, so I think it's good for him to prove himself in an American series as well.
I mean, I got to meet him privately at Gateway, and he was very nice, very humble, very quiet. He really had that happy-go-lucky, I'm just glad to be here kind of mentality to him, which, good for him. I do hope he does well. I don't think negatively of him, like I used to, at least. But I do, and I did get to hear both sides of the story about what happened at Silverstone in the Formula 2 Championship, and I can say his reasons for what happened are understandable. and really there was just a bunch of misunderstandings and misreportings that led up to his ultimate fall from grace in Formula racing. But again, I do hope he does well.
And if you're wondering what happened to this year's drivers in the number 19 Dale Coyne entry, well, Pietro Fittipaldi seems like he wants to be pursuing a WEC career. Of course, he was driving for Dragon Speed at Spa when he had his accident and qualifying for a lap or two before he had his accident. And Zachary Claman de Mello has apparently been let go by Dale Coyne. Yeah, so like I said, it'll be interesting to see if he gets a second chance as a part-time entry in 2019. Now, the final topic that I want to go over in this episode, and of course, yes, if you are a frequent listener, then you would know that this is a pretty much atypical episode. These usually aren't how these episodes go. But we're working with what we have, or at least attempting to work with what we have, or lack of what we have, I should say. Again, Kyle, thank you. We're just going to finish this episode off by talking about the Formula One Championship. Going into their final races of the season, Lewis Hamilton still holds a championship lead over Sebastian Vettel. And we're seeing some team orders, like you just mentioned, playing into that, especially the round in Russia where Valtteri Bottas was basically told straight up to give Lewis the position. Bottas obviously not that happy about that after the race. However, there are some silly season updates to go over in Formula One. We have Danny Kvyat back at Toro Rosso. He's been really all over the place.
This one is interesting because Kvyat was let go after Austin of last year. He looked to be all but done with Formula One. Then earlier this year, before the season began, lo and behold, he pops up as the reserve driver for Ferrari. And so based off of what they were talking about in the free practices after it was announced, that Kvyat really played a very important role in Ferrari because he helped set up the cars. And if something was wrong with the cars on the free practice days, he would actually go and work with the team and get things better before qualifying. So very interesting move. This, again, shows what we highlighted in the last episode about how Red Bull really doesn't have much of a junior program anymore, at least currently. So I'm very curious to see who they could possibly bring in for their second driver.
Yeah, you talk about that. Brendan Hartley, of course, being a full-time driver for them this season. His future right now seems unknown. They're setting Pierre Gasly as the team benchmark. Of course, Pierre Gasly, though, is going to the Red Bull team next year. So Hartley's future really unknown, depends on his performance in the final few races. There are quite a few open seats in Formula One at the moment, though, for next year. Of course, we just mentioned that open Toro Rosso seat. We also have both Williams seats open at the moment, and both Force India seats open now.
Unofficially.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep this a relatively factual-based episode, but if you wanted to come to me and say that Lance Stroll wasn't going to be in Force India next year, I wouldn't believe you. Of course,
and same for Sergio Perez.
Yeah, that all relating to Lance Stroll's father buying out Force India. Now, another thing that we've had, another pretty major silly season update in Formula One is Charles Leclerc going to Ferrari and Kimi Räikkönen moving to Sauber. So those two pretty much doing a complete seat swap. And we also have Antonio Giovinazzi, who I mentioned in the IMSA segment, who wasn't able to race at Petit Le Mans anymore. Well, that's because he's going to Sauber full-time next year, so he will be having some Sauber Formula One commitments on the weekend of Petit Le Mans. Now, this forces Marcus Ericsson out of his seat, unfortunately. He's been at that team since, I believe, 2014? 2015, correct me if I'm wrong. And Ericsson has said that he will be looking elsewhere for possible entries. Possibility we see him go to Williams, but I'm not too sure. He also said that he's been looking into coming stateside and trying out some IndyCar races, so that'd be really interesting to see. And
I want to make
yeah.
I want to make a note on the whole Leclerc and Raikkonen switch. I mean, this year Sauber and Ferrari, of course, have gotten closer as senior and junior team. It seems with Alfa Romeo taking over title partnership. And I think that with Raikkonen going over, it's even strengthens the bond between the two teams, and we've seen obvious improvement with Sauber this year. And I think with Kimi Räikkönen, somebody of his stature who could even bring Lotus to victory in Formula One in 2013, I think honestly, Kimi Räikkönen could actually make Sauber a podium finishing team by the end of next year. I mean, Kimi Räikkönen is one of the best in the business, even though he hasn't won for the obvious reasons, like Valtteri Bottas hasn't won this year. I think Kimi will now become the guy within the team, of course, with Antonio Giovinazzi being second driver. Kimi's the guy in Sauber, and nothing's going to hold him back now. And with Charles Leclerc, I think he's going to finally get the opportunity that he so rightfully deserves. And it's an opportunity that's actually really symbolic because one of his closest friends was Jules Bianchi, who was pretty much in the same position he was in when he raced in Formula One. But Leclerc actually made it to the call-up to go to Ferrari, which is great to see. And I think definitely Leclerc is going to take this and he's going to run with it.
I think Charles Leclerc's start in Ferrari will be a pretty slow, and I think that he will get some time to adapt to the car. I don't think we're going to be seeing podium results right out of the bag. But really, he does have potential. This is only, it will be a second season in Formula One, so I do expect great things out of him in the future. I think that he'll be a great teammate to Sebastian Vettel. And I'd really be interested to see how long it'll take for him to end up with a victory. I'm sure it'll be coming sometime in the not-so-distant future. On the Kimi Räikkönen side of things, you mentioned that you wouldn't be surprised to see him on the podium next year. I am going to respectfully disagree with that. You said he was able to get Lotus a win, but you also have to remember that Lotus was a much higher-ranking team back in 2012-2013.
Debatable-ish. Kind of. I mean, but if you look at Sauber, their performance from last year to this year, look at how much they've gained with the two drivers that they have.
Oh, yeah, there's no denying that. I just think that seeing them break into a podium is a bit of a stretch. Top five, I could see that. Podium would really surprise me, though. I'll have to say that much.
I mean, but anything could happen. Hell, Lance Stroll got a podium last year at Baku, so anything could happen. I want to make a point, though, that Charles Leclerc is almost getting the Max Verstappen treatment. He pretty much is the Max Verstappen for Ferrari, like Max was for Red Bull. I mean, he got promoted relatively quickly, and obviously there's so much behind him now, pushing him into that big three seat that is so coveted. I mean, again, he just has that whole Verstappen sort of thing to him. And a benefit for him for sure, because I think he'll do great things. I think he'll win a race or two next year, personally. Because if he's been getting consistent points with the Sauber. So I could actually see him winning a couple races, definitely finishing on the podium. Now, if he'll win his first race with Ferrari, probably not. Verstappen got very lucky on that one, but yeah.
I.e., both Mercedes taking each other out. But
one of the best F1 moments in the hybrid era.
Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for the 20th episode of the Rain Race podcast. Hopefully, we'll be back next week with either a special and a regular episode, or just a regular episode. Again, it depends on a bunch of variables. But like I said in the beginning of the episode, we do hope to make more frequent episodes up until November, which is really only about 6 weeks, I'd say. So I think we can manage that up until pretty much all the racing action starts to die down. Then we'll have some fun over the winter with some less frequent but still rather interesting episode. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe on YouTube if you are interested, and you can also check us out on Apple Podcasts and Google Play. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode of the Rain Race Podcast. I'll have all of Kevin's stuff linked at the top right on YouTube, and I hope to catch you in the next one.